An ordinary day in Peppa Pig's house passed quietly and almost unnoticed. But Peppa herself immediately noticed. Her little brother George was different. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't running around the house like he usually did. Even his favorite dinosaur lay forgotten in the corner, unwanted. George sat by the window, staring into the grey sky, silent. His eyes seemed empty, as if he wasn't looking at anything at all but falling into a bottomless void. "George?" Peppa asked carefully. "Are you all right?" But he didn't answer. He only slowly turned his head to his sister and gave her a faint smile. That smile wasn't warm. It had no joy, no trace of his usual childish innocence. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. At dinner that evening, he barely ate. Their parents tried to talk, but George replied only in single words, or not at all. Peppa noticed that Mummy and Daddy seemed not to see anything strange. They behaved as if George had always been this quiet and distant. Days passed. Each time Peppa found her brother, he was in a different place, out in the garden, by the window, in the hallway, and every time he just sat there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. His eyes grew emptier with each passing day. Peppa tried to play with him, but he never reacted. Sometimes she caught his stare, long, unblinking, foreign. And then, one evening, Peppa noticed George quietly rise and walk to the door. His steps were slow and steady, as though he knew exactly where he was going. "George, wait!" Peppa called, but he didn't turn back. She ran after him. Outside, drizzle filled the air, cold and heavy. George walked straight toward the forest behind their house. Peppa's heart pounded in her chest faster and faster, but she couldn't stop herself. Curiosity and fear pushed her forward. Deep in the woods stood an old hut. Peppa had never seen it before, even though she'd played in these woods many times. The door hung half open and cold air seeped out. George stepped inside, and after a brief hesitation, Peppa followed him. Inside, it was dark, smelling of dust and mold. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. George stood in the center of the room. Slowly, he turned toward her. His eyes were utterly lifeless, like two bottomless pits. A wide, unnatural smile was frozen on his face. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered. His voice was low, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. Peppa's knees went weak. She stumbled backward, but George melted into the darkness, vanishing as if he had never been there. The room filled with silence, so heavy that her ears rang. Terrified, Peppa ran out of the hut, tripping and stumbling until she reached home. She burst into the hallway, gasping for air, her heart hammering. But when she looked into George's room, she froze. He was there, sitting on the floor, playing with his blocks, as if nothing had happened. He was even humming a soft tune. "George," Peppa whispered. He lifted his head. His eyes were just as empty, his smile just as dreadful. That night, Peppa tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. She listened to every sound in the house, and then she heard it. First a faint rustle, then a quiet scraping. It was coming from under her bed. Peppa slowly leaned over and peeked beneath. There sat Laboo, her favorite toy. But now, he didn't look the same. His eyes glowed red in the darkness, reflecting the dim light from the window. His smile was stretched far too wide, so distorted it looked as though the fabric of his face had split apart. In his tiny hands, Laboo held a figure. Peppa's heart stopped when she recognized it. It was George, a small, pale copy of her brother with empty eyes and lifeless skin. Laboo raised the figure to his face. His glowing eyes flared brighter, and his smile twisted into something almost inhuman. "He is mine now," he whispered in a low, alien voice. Peppa recoiled, clutching her blanket, squeezing her eyes shut. She prayed it was only a dream. But when she opened them again, Laboo was still there. In his hands, the figure of George remained. Peppa understood. It was him. It was Laboo who had changed George. He had stolen his soul, and now he wouldn't stop. George was only the beginning. The house grew quiet, too quiet. Even her parents in recent days seemed to have forgotten their younger child. When Peppa asked about him, they only gave her long, blank looks and replied, "We've only ever had you." And in that moment, Peppa realized the most terrible truth. Laboo hadn't just taken George. He had begun erasing him. He was sinking deeper and deeper into their house, into their family, into reality itself. And at night, sitting on the shelf in Peppa's room, Laboo smiled faintly. His red eyes glowed dimly in the darkness, and Peppa knew soon he would come for her too. Rain had been falling all evening. Drops tapped softly against the glass, and Peppa Pig's house was wrapped in a grey twilight. Peppa and George sat on the floor, stacking colourful blocks into a tower. Everything seemed ordinary, until the front door slammed shut. "Daddy? Mummy?" Peppa called. No answer. Only the sound of wet footsteps echoed through the hallway. Peppa stood up and peeked into the living room. Her parents were standing by the door. At first glance, they looked the same, but something was wrong. Mummy Pig was smiling, yet the smile was frozen, like it had been painted on. Her eyes were dark, without reflection. Daddy Pig moved too smoothly, as if his body slid rather than walked. A chill ran down Peppa's back. "You got wet?" she asked quietly. Daddy Pig tilted his head. Too far, then farther, and farther still, until it turned completely around. Peppa stepped back, clutching George. Mummy Pig took a step forward, her body bending unnaturally, as if her bones had turned soft. "Mummy?" George whispered. The answer was a low rasp, almost laughter, but without joy. Peppa grabbed George's hoof and ran upstairs. The boards creaked beneath them, as though the house itself tried to hold them back. The bedroom door slammed shut, and Peppa turned the key. Downstairs, silence returned. Only the rain outside and their quick, frightened breathing. Then came the first sound, a long, scraping noise, like claws on wood. Something was dragging a paw along the door. Then a whisper, at first faint and muffled, then closer, until it sounded as if voices were speaking right through the keyhole. The shadows on the walls began to move. They pulsed and shifted, changing shape as if alive. One stretched to the ceiling and started crawling toward the bed. Peppa pressed George against herself, eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder. The wood groaned under the weight of unseen claws, and suddenly the darkness burst into two blazing eyes, fiery yellow, unblinking. They pierced the room like light through smoke. From the blackness emerged a massive owl. Its wings were spread wide, its talons long and sharp, its gaze cold and intelligent. It tilted its head, and its hoot sounded like a deep, mocking laugh. The windows rattled from the sound. Peppa shielded George, feeling the owl's shadow stretch across the walls. The creature moved closer to the door, slowly, deliberately. Every touch of its talon left a mark, deep scratches that seemed to melt the wood. The owl leaned toward the keyhole. In the silence came the sound of breathing, heavy and rasping. "Pay, pay," a voice whispered. She couldn't tell whether it was the owl speaking or something else entirely. The door trembled, first gently, then stronger. It seemed ready to crack. The shadows on the walls gathered together, pulling toward a single point. The whole room shivered, and then it stopped. Total silence. Only the rain remained. Peppa didn't move for a long time. Finally, she crept to the door and pressed her ear to it. Nothing. She exhaled slowly and turned to George. He sat motionless, staring into the corner of the room. Peppa followed his gaze and saw it. On the floor, beneath the window, in a small puddle of rainwater, was a single claw print. Outside, the forest loomed dark. Something moved among the trees. Peppa squinted and saw a shape, tall, with vast wings spread wide. It stood silently on a branch, watching. The owl had not left. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window, a second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves, a pale sky, mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees, watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there, but no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, it opened. That day, Peppa and her little sister Ivy were playing happily in their room. Peppa was building a tall tower with blocks, while Ivy, always a curious little one, was exploring every corner of the room. Suddenly, Ivy noticed something under Peppa's bed. She crawled over and pulled out a strange yellow toy with huge black eyes and sharp, realistic-looking teeth. The little one clapped her hands joyfully, hugging the find close to herself. Peppa was surprised. She had never seen this toy before. On the tag was written a strange name, Laboo. "Ivy, where did you get this toy?" "I've never seen it before," said Peppa, examining the strange creature. "What a weird name. And its teeth look so real." Despite the uneasy feeling, Peppa let Ivy play with the new toy. And then, something incredible happened. A second window appeared in the room, one that had never been there before. Behind this dark window stretched a gloomy forest with trees resembling the silhouettes of Laboo toys. "What is this? Where did this window come from?" exclaimed Peppa in shock. But Ivy seemed completely oblivious to the new window. She was entirely absorbed in playing with Laboo. Little Ivy pressed the toy to her ear, as if listening to something very important. She smiled and nodded her head, as if agreeing with something. "Ivy, who are you talking to?" asked the worried Peppa, but the little one just continued hugging the toy and smiling. When their mother entered the room, Peppa tried to tell her about the strange window and toy. "Mummy, look! A second window appeared in our room, and Ivy is talking to this strange toy," Peppa said excitedly, but their mother couldn't see anything. For her, there was only an ordinary wall, and Ivy was simply playing by herself. "You have quite an imagination, Peppa," said their mother, and left, unaware of the approaching danger. "But Mummy, it's right here!" cried Peppa, but it was useless. As night fell, events took an even more sinister turn. Peppa couldn't sleep, watching the dark window. Meanwhile, Ivy, hugging Laboo, began humming a strange, mesmerizing melody. The little one couldn't speak yet, but she hummed this tune as if she had known it her whole life. "Laboo, Laboo." "Ivy, what are you singing? How do you know this song?" asked Peppa fearfully, but Ivy just continued humming and rocking with the toy. Peppa looked at the second window and was horrified. Behind the glass, dozens of pairs of eyes were glowing. An entire army of Laboo toys was watching them from the dark forest. The next night, the most terrible thing happened. Peppa woke up to an unusual silence. Ivy's crib was empty. The Laboo toy had also disappeared. The second window was wide open, and in the forest, Peppa saw the retreating silhouette of her little sister. Ivy was walking, holding hands with a large figure that looked like Laboo. "Ivy, come back!" screamed Peppa, but it was too late. Ivy disappeared into the depths of the dark forest, and the window behind her closed and dissolved into the wall as if it had never existed. In the morning, their parents searched the entire house, the entire neighborhood, but Ivy was nowhere to be found. Mummy cried, Daddy called the police, and Peppa remained silent. She knew the truth, but who would believe her? A whole year passed. Peppa learned to live with this terrible secret. She played alone in her room, which now seemed too big and empty without Ivy's laughter. And then one day, while cleaning under her bed, Peppa found a small teddy bear. It was so cute and harmless. "What a lovely bear," smiled Peppa, picking it up. But as soon as she lifted the teddy bear, that same dark window appeared in the room again. Behind the glass stood Ivy. But this was no longer the cheerful little one that Peppa remembered. Ivy's skin had turned yellow, and her eyes were black, just like Laboo's. In her hands, she held that same cursed toy and slowly waved her hand. Although Ivy couldn't speak, Peppa seemed to hear her voice in her head. "Join us, big sister." Peppa dropped the teddy bear in horror. She realized that the nightmare was just beginning, and now Laboo had come for her. At night, Peppa opened her eyes. The house felt strange. The ceiling was cracked, the walls were damp, and the air was heavy and cold. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled, but it sounded wrong, like someone whispering. George was sitting nearby. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, staring into the dark. "George, what's wrong?" Peppa asked. He silently pointed toward the door. A dim light flickered in the hallway. Peppa carefully climbed down from her bed and followed her brother. The house was empty. There were no smells of Mummy Pig's cooking. The TV in the living room was off, and beyond the windows there was no garden, only endless fog. They walked slowly. The floorboards creaked under their feet and water dripped from the ceiling. When Peppa opened the bathroom door, she froze. Where the mirror used to hang, there was now a door, narrow, blue, as if painted right onto the tiles. "It wasn't here before," Peppa whispered. George stepped closer, reached out his little hoof, and touched the handle. The door opened. No creak, no sound, just silently swung inward into a thick blue darkness. A cold draft came from within. George stepped through without looking back. The door closed behind him. Peppa was left alone. She knocked, called his name, but there was no answer. A few minutes later, the door opened again. George came out, covered in dust, as if he'd been somewhere ancient. His eyes looked empty. "Where were you?" Peppa asked. He whispered, "There, blue rooms." And a shadow. Its waiting Peppa didn't understand. George went to bed, but all night he tossed and turned, mumbling in his sleep. The next night, it happened again. The blue door appeared once more, and again, only George could open it. Peppa tried to grab his hoof, but her touch passed through the air, as though the door existed only for him. When he returned, his fur was no longer dusty but covered in soot. His eyes glowed faintly with an eerie light. He didn't want to talk. "Only sometimes," he whispered. "Laboo is inside. He's watching." Peppa began to notice strange things. The shadows in the corners of the room started to move on their own. The water in the sink looked dark, like a mirror. When she called George, he turned his head slowly, as if unsure who was speaking to him. "George, it's me, your sister," she said quietly. One night, Peppa woke up to the sound of footsteps. George was standing by her bed. His eyes shone with a cold blue light. In them, Peppa saw not their room, but a reflection of rippling water, as if inside his gaze was a river. In that murky water, shapes were moving. Peppa gasped. George smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "He's calling," he whispered. "He wants you to come too." Peppa ran to the bathroom. The blue door was there again, glowing faintly, as if lit from within. Moist air flowed from it, and on the floor shimmered a trembling reflection, like the surface of water. She didn't go closer. She knew if she opened it, she wouldn't come back. The next morning, the door was gone. Only a damp wall remained, and a dark hoofprint mark on the floor. George sat on his bed, calm, as if nothing had happened. "Where were you?" she asked. He smiled. "I'm already home." But when Peppa looked into his eyes, she thought she saw movement behind the reflection of the room, a blue shadow shaped like Laboo, sliding across his pupil before vanishing. Since then, Peppa has never seen the blue door again. But every night, when the house grows too quiet, somewhere deep within the walls, there comes a soft sound, as if someone is turning a blue handle once more. Morning in Peppa Pig's house began differently than usual. She opened her eyes and immediately felt something was wrong. The room looked familiar, but the air was heavy, pressing, filled with a suffocating silence. George lay beside her, hugging his dinosaur, but she couldn't even hear his breathing. Peppa carefully got up and went downstairs. Normally, at this time, Mummy Pig would be making breakfast, and the house would be filled with the smell of porridge. But now, a different smell greeted her. Cold, empty, like a room where no one had lived for a very long time. Her family was waiting in the living room. Mummy, Daddy, and George sat on the sofa. They didn't move, they didn't speak. Their eyes were completely empty, like two black ovals, without reflection, without life. On their faces was the same wide, identical smile. They turned their heads toward Peppa all at once, and there was nothing natural in that movement. Peppa took a step back, and at that moment the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showed static, and then her reflection. Only it wasn't hers. The face on the screen was distorted, the eyes too big, the mouth twisted, and most terrifying of all, It didn't move the way she did. When Peppa blinked, the reflection kept staring with wide, unblinking eyes. When she raised her hoof, her copy did the same, but with a delay and at a strange angle, like a puppet pulled on strings. Sound filled the room. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't music. It was a jumble of distorted phrases, spoken backwards. They overlapped, merging into a droning noise that made her ears ache. Peppa covered them with her hooves, but the sound continued inside her head. Her family stood up from the sofa and took a step forward. Their movements were synchronized, which made it even more terrifying. Peppa ran upstairs into her room and slammed the door shut. But the mirror in her bedroom was already waiting for her. Inside was the same copy from the screen. It was moving faster now, scratching at the glass with its hooves from the inside. Cracks spread across the surface, and its lips began to move. At first, silently. Then, through the crackling, she heard words, backwards and barely recognizable. "Let me in." The mirror splintered. In panic, Peppa pulled back, clutching the doorknob. And at that instant, everything fell silent again. The silence was thick, buzzing. She slowly went downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with a new, horrifying sight. Sitting right on the table was Laboo. Her favorite toy had always seemed harmless, but now it looked different. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its smile stretched too wide, as if the fabric of its face was ready to rip apart. In Laboo's paws was George's torn dinosaur. Threads hung from it, and the plastic body was twisted into an unnatural pose. Peppa froze, unable to move. Laboo slowly lifted its head. Its mouth didn't move, but a long hissing sound came from within. Then it stretched its tiny paw toward Peppa. Fear paralyzed her. She felt she couldn't scream, couldn't run. Laboo tilted its head slightly, as if saying, "You knew it would come to this." She felt the walls of the house begin to tremble. Lights flickered on in the corridor by themselves. Shadows stretched across the walls, too long, moving as if they were copying her every gesture. The television turned on again, and this time the distorted Peppa didn't just appear on the screen. It began to crawl halfway out. Its lips stretched into a grin, and it winked. Peppa covered her face with her hooves. She understood this day would not end. It would repeat again and again. And Laboo, sitting on the table, was there to make sure of it. His eyes glowed red. His smile stretched even wider. He was waiting. Peppa opened her eyes in the middle of the night and immediately realized something had changed. Their cozy room looked unfamiliar. The wallpaper was peeling, the ceiling was cracked, and toys were scattered in the dust. George had also woken up and sat on his bed, sobbing softly. "Peppa, this isn't our house," he whispered, clutching his dinosaur. The silence was so thick it rang in their ears. And then it broke. In the living room, the television hummed to life. They both knew no one had turned it on. The screen flickered with static, distorting the darkness of the room. Peppa carefully led her brother by the paw downstairs. The living room looked even worse. The floor was stained with damp spots. The furniture creaked as if it had been standing for hundreds of years. Jagged lines and blurry silhouettes danced across the screen. "Mummy? Daddy?" Peppa called, but only a distorted, heavy voice replied, "You have been happy for too long. Now it's time to pay." George clapped his hands over his ears in horror, while Peppa stepped closer. Two glowing spots appeared on the screen. One cold blue, the other warm orange. From these patches of light, shapes began to take form. Their bodies looked as though they were built from blocks, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. "It's Los Bros," Peppa whispered. "We've come," they said in unison. Their voices sounded as if they came from both the television and directly inside her head. At that moment, Peppa noticed the mirror on the wall. She looked into it and froze. Staring back at her was herself, but twisted. Her eyes were enormous and black, her mouth stretched into a wide grin, and behind her reflection stood two figures, one blue, one orange. Peppa screamed. George, terrified, ran toward the door and suddenly vanished. His cry echoed through the empty house before silence fell again. "George!" Peppa shouted. She dashed through the rooms, opening every door, but their house was no longer a home. Corridors stretched endlessly, windows looked out into black emptiness. On the floor lay George's dinosaur. The toy was dirty, marked with strange stains, blue and orange prints, as though someone had gripped it with both hands. Peppa's heart pounded. She picked up the toy and heard laughter. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath her. The laughter was childlike and cheerful, yet there was something tortured within it. The television flared again, and now the figures of Los Bros appeared clearly. On the left stood Tralalerit, his aura glowing blue, eyes burning with a cold gleam. His grin was so wide it seemed it might tear his face apart. On the right stood Tung Tung Tungsito, bathed in orange light. His movements were sharp, his stare piercing, as if he could see straight through her soul. "Where's George?" Peppa cried, though her voice trembled. "He's with us," one answered. "Now it's your turn," added the other. A stream of black smoke burst from the television. It whirled into a vortex, and the entire house began to change. The floor cracked, the walls bent and warped, the ceiling sank lower. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt as heavy as stone. The shadows on the walls came alive, stretching into hands that clawed at her dress. She tore herself free, but standing before her now were Los Bros themselves. No longer on the screen, but in the room. Their blocky bodies seemed alive, yet their eyes were alien. Blue and orange light intertwined, wrapping around everything. Peppa felt her breathing grow heavier, her heart tighten in her chest. "We will play," they said in unison. "Forever." They stepped closer. The floor beneath her feet vanished, and Peppa fell into a crimson void. The last thing she saw were their faces grinning in the darkness, and their hands reaching out to her. And then the house sank into silence. Only in the forest, near their home, one can sometimes hear children's laughter and a faint whisper carrying two voices, one blue, one orange. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window, a second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky, mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees, watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower. almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night,